Hello and welcome to the Global Summit on Economic Abuse. Before we begin, I'd like to go over to some general housekeeping rules. You, at the moment, are signed in as a participant, and your camera and microphone are disabled. But today's session will be recorded for future viewing. In the contents of the session, there'll be some issues raised. We encourage you, if they are hard and raises any triggering issues, to make sure that you prioritize your well-being. And if you like support, please go to the link below, and you'll find the link to the No More Global Directory, which specializes with information on domestic abuse and sexual violence services. Thank you so much for your cooperation, and we really, really hope that you enjoy this session as the ones that have come before it. I am personally really, really excited to welcome to this very powerful session a group of change makers, women who really have led the work globally around economic abuse. In this panel, we will explore advocacy, cross-sector innovation, and some legal systemic shifts. But we will explore them through the experiences of leaders in this space. So without any further ado, I will want to welcome panelists. First, we have Sonia Passi. She's the founder of Free From in the US. We have Dr. Nicola Sharp Jeffs from the International Coalition Against Economic Abuse. We have Rebecca Glenn from the Center for Women's Safety in Australia. We have Meseret Halises, and she's a thought leader, serial social entrepreneur, and founder of the Canadian Center for Women's Economic Empowerment. And finally, we have Erica Sussman, founder and executive director of the Center for Survivor Agency and Justice, also in the US. And so we want to, I really want to deep down in one of those things that really, as leaders and change makers in the space, people often come and ask us, which is, what motivates you to keep on working and talking and pushing on the issue of economic abuse? Why the importance of the issue, but also what keeps you motivated to keep on the fight for it? And Sonia, let's start with you.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Such a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me. I mean, what motivates me, without a doubt, is my almost 3-year-old daughter and wanting her to grow up in a world where she doesn't have a 30% chance of experiencing abuse and a much higher chance of experiencing economic abuse. But also, outside of my personal life and just in the work itself, the thing about economic abuse is it's so tactile and it's so tangible. And day in, day out, I am seeing through Free From's work how addressing economic abuse can really support a survivor in getting to thriving, not just for themselves, but for their children, and really breaking the cycle of generational violence. And I think when you've seen that working at something works, it motivates you to keep doing it over and over and over again, because you know it can get to the end goal, the end result that you want.
And Becca, what does that mean for you?
Well, I guess I came to this work from a background in financial well-being, and it was something that I was really passionate about from quite an early age. Like, I knew that money was freedom, money was options, and I wanted, as a feminist, I wanted that financial independence. And I guess that was before I knew anything about domestic violence, really. But I guess for me, the spark that really kind of, lit the fire in the belly was supporting a friend through economic abuse and seeing just how devastating the impacts were. And I guess once you've once you come to understand economic abuse, you do start to see just how prevalent it is. And so what motivated me to actually sort of make this my work was seeing the impact and then understanding the scale of the problem, the scale of the injustice, and not just on an individual level, you can see, the long-lasting consequences of it. But I think the other thing that really concerned me was seeing the extent of system involvement, systems that are facilitating and perpetuating and extending that harm that is caused by abusers. So, and really every day in my conversations with survivors, that it's just reinforced. We're just seeing how devastating it can be. And so what keeps me going, I guess, is that I really do have a sense that change is possible. I can see that change is in fact happening. And that really, that gives me hope and keeps me going.
I love how for both of you, there's kind of a personal motivation that has kind of, really kind of brings it out. And then, the kind of faith on the ongoing work. Nicola, why do you keep on doing it?
Oh, I'm going to follow the same pattern, Pamela.
There we
so
go.
I think I fell into it. I was doing policy and parliamentary work, went to a domestic abuse charity, spoke to survivors of domestic abuse, either in refuge accommodation, which might be called shelter elsewhere, or who were accessing services in the community. And I just remember having a moment where I thought, oh my God, this could be me. I was so naive, I guess I hadn't understood the drivers of abuse, the imbalances of power. And I guess I saw it as an individual's problem before I knew better. And when I recognised it could be me, it was nothing about the survivors sat in front of me. It was about what someone had done to them, and how perhaps their whole life had been going along quite nicely, thank you, before that happened. They were educated, working hard, investing, and somebody came along and took away their future, took away their securities, took away their stability, not only for them, but also for their children. I just thought, oh my God, this is just so unfair. This is just so unjust. And there was no survivor who I spoke to who didn't either talk about the economic impact of abuse broadly or the specific impacts of economic abuse, although I think sometimes it's hard to untangle those things. I looked to see what there was about that, what could be done. And back when I was having those conversations in 2008, there was nothing. So for me, that's what motivated me. I thought this can't be allowed to happen. And that's what started the journey. And I'm sure we'll talk about the journey, so I won't go into that. But yeah, just seeing that change incrementally, to be able to look back and see real differences for victims and survivors. I mean, we're not as close as we need to be by any stretch of the imagination, but things are better, and that does give me hope. And working alongside survivors to create that change, it's just so rewarding. It really is.
And Meseret, how did that look for you?
Yes. Thank you so much for having me. So I started the Canadian Center for Women Empowerment because of my lived experience. I came with a background of global health, maternal and newborn health. Most of my work was on gender-based violence and sexual reproductive health rights, but I didn't know what economic abuse looks like. So I was left with debt under my name. I was also denied housing to access, and I was also denied banking. Even my mortgage was locked, and I was pushed, out by the system, and then I was perpetuated by the system. So I've seen that, it was very, very painful journey. I experienced it, and most of the experience was a systemic barrier as a Black woman in the immigrant this country. And then as I tried to build my life, I realized that thousands of women across Canada, even in Africa, I came from Ethiopia. And of course, I used to be also very vocal on gender-based violence in many spaces. So I learned that there is 1,000 women are facing the same problem. And unfortunately, because of, the sociocultural issues and because of the stereotype, women, we don't talk about it. even now, when I start to even begin this work, there was no awareness in Canada, no policy, no national framework, no national data. It was the most invisible, under-recorded, and underreported form of violence for many years. But as you know, today, Canada recognizes economic abuse as a critical part of gender-based violence intervention. And then that's how I, started. And also I'll keep doing this work because I have a daughter. She's a teenager. And I don't want the next generation to struggle and to suffer and to perpetuate by the systemic barriers. And then, of course, violence is also, it's very skyrocketed in Canada, even globally, as you know, after post-pandemic. I've seen also many thousand women who looks like me is like, struggling this, with this issue. So yeah, that's my motivation and that's my purpose.
I love that. In both cases, seeing other women also kind of struggling, and the ignorance in other women, kind of generates that kind of motivation to keep on, which I think a lot of advocates, will feel that in other spaces, right, on the gender-based violence spectrum. Erica, what motivates you?
Yeah, thanks for having me, and so wonderful to actually be here in this moment with everybody. As a new lawyer, my first client, her name was Barbara, and she was a teenage girl who had immigrated to the US because she felt that it would bring her a whole host of opportunities. Instead, she was met with physical abuse, labor trafficking at the hands of her father. And we managed to get a protection order for her, but without any sort of educational opportunity or job opportunity or access to housing, she wasn't safe. And I still remember her saying to me, Erica, if only I had known what it would be like here, I never would have come. I also think of a client that I had whose name was Nazratu, and her husband had physically abused her. And one day she came downstairs to her kitchen and found a credit card bill on her counter, which was over $30,000 for a credit card that was opened in her name that she had no idea even existed. So without credit damage, with an enormous amount of credit damage, she also struggled to find housing and a job. These experiences and a bunch of others that I had early on really encouraged me to kind of think about what safety really requires. And the answer at that point, and still today, is that there is no safety without economic security. And that really was the founding principle of the Center for Survivor Agency and Justice, and remains that to this day. We know that there is, of course, a very close relationship between abuse, which depletes survivors of resources, and that type of economic hardship, of course, deprives people of choices to live their lives in ways that they want and on their terms. So, and we also know that it's not a one-time thing, but really compounds over the course of one's life course, and that our institutions and our systems and policies are gatekeepers in that. The good news, of course, is that, just as those systems and institutions can cause harm, so too can they provide pathways to economic opportunity. And that really is the space where I see lots of opportunity, because it really challenges us as advocates, as stakeholders, wherever we are in this space, to think about what our role is in advancing survivor economic agency. So yeah, when you ask me about what motivates me to do this work, it's the stories of survivors, both individual stories, but also collective stories that really reveal what those barriers are and where those opportunities are for transformation.
Thank you for that. I hear a lot of like women helping women, trying to help future women. And that is, that's kind of a great thing to move us all, especially in an area as economic abuse. Now, I really want to kind of shift a little bit of conversation into I like to remember myself when I started. I was 21 years old in Manhattan Family Court. I had 80 cases. And I always looked at leadership at that moment in the sector. And now we are in those positions of leadership. So I always like to talk to people about journey. What was the journey from when you started kind of, looking at this? I'd like to talk to that 21-year-old and say how all of this, pathway of years kind of look like. So I know there's many advocates right now hearing you. So I would love to hear about your journey. How was economic abuse dealt at that time? And, how has that in a way shifted a bit to where we are now, but in the context of your own pathway? And Sonia, I'm going to throw that big ball to you right now.
Sure. I started doing this work when I was 16. I actually grew up in the UK. And when I was 16, I thought I wanted to be a human rights lawyer. And so I started an Amnesty International group at my high school. And their campaign that year was global violence against women. And so I got all of these materials in the mail and I started reading them. And page 2 of this pamphlet said 1 in 3 women globally will be subjected to gender-based violence. And I remember where I was, what I was wearing. Like, I remember that moment viscerally. I remember being so shocked that I was hearing this for the first time in a pamphlet that I had requested in the mail. And I didn't understand why it wasn't breaking news every single day. I didn't understand why it wasn't the front page of every newspaper. It was obviously a global crisis. And I grew up in and around a lot of different kinds of abuse. At that point in my life, I had no words for it. But in that moment, I was like, this is what I'm going to spend the rest of my life working on. And so it was very fortuitous to be that young and figure it out. Of course, I had no idea what that meant. I was new to the issue. In terms of working on the issue, I started hosting domestic violence awareness weeks at my high school. I then went on to college and started a group that was educating campus students about dating violence and intimate partner violence. And because I came to this through Amnesty, because this was introduced to me as a human rights issue, I understood it as a human rights issue, which is not really how we talk about it in our day-to-day. It's really like, this is a private issue, this is a personal issue. I was introduced to it as a human rights issue, which in and of itself was a blessing to be educated in that way. I decided I needed to go to law school. I was like, this is a human rights issue. I need to understand law and policy to really understand how you solve a problem like this. I went to Berkeley Law in California, and in my second year of law school, I'm sat in the domestic violence law class. And my professor says, in 50% of cases of domestic violence, survivors lose custody of their children. But the law actually says that that should not happen. And what we really need is somebody to appeal these cases so that, because survivors can't afford appeals. But if someone could appeal these cases, they wouldn't be losing custody of their children. And so I went up to her at the end of class and I said, that sounds like a really serious problem. And that sounds like a really easy solution. Let's appeal these cases. And I had no idea what I was really saying. And she had no idea what she was really saying when she said yes. But a couple months later, we started an organization that 15 years later is still thriving in California and is appealing domestic violence cases, winning those appeals, and then publishing those cases and creating binding case law in California. But what I was seeing over and over again, this happened with every single client we took. We would work with someone who was 3 to 5 years out of the abuse, and every single person that we worked with was financially devastated. and they were either living in their car or living on someone's couch. And this kept happening over and over again. So much so that I was like, well, this is obviously an economic problem. I'm seeing a pattern here. How are we addressing it? And that's when I really started to look and understand and research what was out there. And for the most part, our society's response to the problem, first of all, support is only offered at a moment of acute crisis. And then the support that's offered is offered for a short amount of time. And we were not addressing the economics of it. We really were just sort of putting band-aids on a problem: temporary restraining orders, access to public assistance, access to temporary housing. And now, and this is in no way purely because of Free From, the work of CSAG has been huge, and others in our field here in the US, but I think now economic abuse is very much understood as a dominant force, a dominant issue that needs to be addressed. We have states taking accountability for this, employers taking accountability for this, banks taking accountability for this. And it's understood to be a key part of the problem that needs to be addressed.
Thank you for sharing that, Sonia. I think first it sounds to me like you had a calling.
Yeah.
That it's a moment. And you seem to be like a very curious person, like what's happening, why is this happening? And I think everybody should explore curiosity who's working in this field, right? And then you decided to push forward, most likely with gut, for what I can sense, and trying to kind of create change. So thank you so much for that. And Rebecca, how was this for you?
Quite different, I guess. When I was 21, I was still at uni, but my first job was actually as a journalist. So I was well away from that. But I certainly recall as a sort of newbie journalist, working weekends, and was called out to, there'd been a big story, big drug bust or something. So I went to the court where this, they were going to appear. And sitting in the court before they appeared, every single case on this Saturday morning that appeared in that court was a domestic violence case. And it was just really, I wasn't actually going to talk about this, but Sonia, it just reminded me, my sense was, why is this not the news? This is every single case. And here I am not reporting on that. I'm reporting on a drug bust. Anyway, so look, I came to the economic abuse work in my mid-40s, so a lot later, and I guess there were a number of things that really sort of led to that. I was working at a bank at the time. It's actually Commonwealth Bank, which is sponsoring this conference, but and working in financial wellbeing, but had worked on a number of initiatives at the bank, the Addressing Financial Abuse Guide, the Women's Financial Wellbeing Guide, which were kind of over and above my actual sort of formal role there. And I guess what I had the sense of was, this is the work that I want to be doing. This is the work that is like getting me out of bed in the morning, that I'm passionate about. And so I set about going, like, it seems there's this really big problem and there's not really like a commensurate sort of sized solution. Am I missing something? So I went and spoke to a bunch of people in the sort of domestic violence sector and the financial counselling sector. But I guess there were probably two, I think, key events that really shaped the Centre for Women's Economic Safety and what it became. And the first was a meeting I had with Sal Dennis, who runs Inside Exchange, which is part of a domestic violence service in Sydney. And I asked her about, setting up an organisation like this, and she said, there's definitely a need. We see it all the time, but we're not, sure how to respond necessarily. But I've got a question for you. And that is, you're going to start raising awareness and talking about this, your comms background. That was kind of what I had initially thought I could contribute to the issue. And she said, so you're going to start talking about this issue publicly, and then where do women go? And I said, I don't know. I don't know what that looks like. I certainly didn't have a satisfactory answer. So anyway, I ended up going and working with her for a number of years, but it was also part of why I applied to do a Churchill Fellowship. And that was, I guess, the second really important piece of work that contributed to the shaping of the Centre for Women's Economic Safety. And also have to shout out that the women on the screen here are women that I met as part of the Churchill Fellowship and shaped very, very much what I do. And it's just such a pleasure to be on screen with you all. And I wish I've met Nick in person now, but I still haven't met in person everyone else because I, of course, did my Churchill during COVID. Anyway, so but my Churchill was looking at service response to women experiencing economic abuse. And so yeah, we then set up the Centre for Women's Economic Safety really in response to those things. And we do raise awareness. We were inspired by Messi to bring Economic Abuse Awareness Day to Australia. I was inspired by Erica to, adopt that. Without economic safety, there is no safety. And we developed a direct service support for survivors of economic abuse called Money Clinics. And that's sort of a key initiative of the centre. So, but in terms of where we are now, you asked, what was it like when we started, which was about 10 years ago. Centre for Women's Economic Safety only started 5 years ago. But we've seen a real shift in Australia in the public conversation around economic abuse. We've had, there are more advocates. There's some great work happening. We have a sort of a national economic abuse reference group. We've seen banks and corporates really start to take the issue seriously. We have a national plan to end violence against women and children, which actually calls out economic abuse as one of 6 key focus areas. So we've seen a real shift. The landscape now compared to even 5 years ago is quite different. And I had a quick look at my Churchill report and the recommendations I made in that, and I saw that out of 10 recommendations to improve service responses, we've seen significant progress on 7 of those. By no means job done. There is still a lot of work to do, but I guess, as I said before, it feels hopeful that progress is possible.
Thank you so much for that, Rebecca. I think you also had a moment of understanding how much the incidence of the issue. Interestingly, we all have different routes. So you work in the corporation, which tells that a lot of people can come out and then shift and do this kind of a public service. It sounded to me like you looked for information, you looked for partners, you look to learn, and then ultimately went for the fellowship to kind of finish that kind of cycle of learning and knowing how or what to push forward, which I think they're all key important lessons for anybody seeing this, right? And trying to figure out what is their next step, right? Might be learning, going out, talking to others who are working on the space, going out and networking, or applying for a fellowship like Churchill. So thank you for that. Messeret, how was it? How was it for you? And how have things progressed?
So actually, it's a good time to ask because we are still on the excitement, and I would say it's a tear of joy for me. I don't know if you've seen the news.
Yeah, congratulations.
Advocacy. Yes, yeah, it's really very important work, and I'm so happy. So as I said, when I start in Canada, there is no any organization even talk about economic and financial abuse. My personally, when I experience, systemic barriers, I had a Facebook group and 420 survivors across Canada. I'm very into social at that time. So I asked them one question like, do you know about, the term economic and financial abuse? And I was very surprised. Most of the women, they have a lot of financial struggle because of abuse, even they don't know if it was economic abuse. Even I was told, oh, is it like the economic recession happened in Canada? It happens in 2018. So people, they see like it's a government economic abuse, not they couldn't even, understand what it looks like to that extent. So that was a turning point, as I said. It was really, really very difficult when we start because our financial institutions are It's the most inaccessible. All the leaders are, old, white men and never been in poverty. They don't understand intersectionalities and a number of things. So we're able to knock every door and start a conversation in the shelter. So I personally, as I said, even beyond my lived experience, my first job was a midwife. I used to deliver a baby in rural Africa where there isn't any water, technology. Sometimes we walk on foot to save women life 5-6 hours. And when HIV AIDS hit Africa as well, I used to work with ILO, with World Bank and few organizations to make sure that workplace HIV is, as a center of intervention. But we have seen is gender-based violence also a huge issue. At that time, it was a taboo. We don't talk about it, of course, and also we think GBV is something separate forms of other social and health issues. So I know the impact and the complexities and everything. So when I came to here, Canada, as you know, Canada is one of the G7 country, welcome immigrants, a lot of immigrants across the world. So many women who looks like me, they live in shame and guilt because of the systemic discrimination and also racism as well.
Mhm.
So when we start, as I said, we use some statistics from Dr. Nicola Sharp to your statistics. Well, so yeah, because I was asked show me the data. Is it a real problem? That's what I was told. But glad those small researches and conversation globally that really helps me to amplify, my voice. Thank you so much, Dr. Nicola, by the way. And then after that, we established our national task force because I couldn't get support and I couldn't get a voice. But the people who have lived experience, they are telling me this is an everyday issues. So after we found, we invited those 420 women and also decision maker across Canada. Actually, I was very vocal with my other work, had very good connection with the federal government and also international as well in the UN space. So many of the expertise, I believe 60 organizations, they join our task force. And then we were asking them why you joined this task force. And I was very surprised. They told me, hey, I know this. My friend, my parent, even I have a lived experience. So I'm here to help you. So that was a motivation in the journey I get from many survivors across Canada to push these issues, as a national agenda. So now, fast forward, Canada now, the government include this form of violence in the National Action Plan, which is in 2020. And also recently, 2 weeks ago, as you see in media, our finance minister, which is a new liberal government, they came up with 3 key call to action. Number 1, Canada will have a code of conduct, which is very important like UK. And the second thing is we're going to have a new agency. This new agency also fights any financial fraud, which is also another step for us because romance scam is also very high in survivors right now because of the dating app revolutions and many things.
Mhm.
And the third is we're going to have a strategy. So we were also advocated Canada, we need to have a strategy because Canada is one of the G7 country, the first country demonstrated the international feminist response at the global level. But for here Canadians, no one talks about economic and financial abuse. So now we are in a stage of confidence. Even today we had a meeting with one of the bankers association. They used to use financial abuse because there is a senior program, but we told them let's exercise to use the word economic abuse, and we're very happy now. The government also, they will update their website, and then we'll continue this work. So what I learned, my voice is very important. Collective effort and centering survivors in any intervention is critical. So this is where I'm at, and I hope with all your support, definitely we'll also continue disrupting other sectors. So the retailer sector is another sector we want to focus. And of course, we are also disrupting the tourism and hotel industry because this has the largest corporate, many migrant women, 51%, they're looking for a job. So employment sabotage is so huge. So we're on that stage right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Messeret. And I love, and I am 100% sure that you've all used research and information and programs that some of you here have also developed together, and you're here sitting down together. And that is amazing. And I think that's what true leadership actually means, and learning from each other. And I love that, you, as we've heard before, the journey wasn't linear, and you decided to ask survivors and make a group of survivors to really be, that kind of influence. I love, which I'm sure everybody here who went in detail would have, also said this, the power of partnerships and networks and creating networks and pushing those networks forward to actually create systemic change, which is what I read here, right? So for anybody hearing us, networks and meeting people, and you you start working with somebody today, but you don't know where they are like 3-4 years ago. That's really impulses this type of work. We're gonna pass it to you, Nicola. Now, how was this journey for you?
Well, definitely not linear again. And I have to apologise if I disappeared from screen. It turns out that I hadn't plugged my laptop in, which was very silly. Lucky I was near a plug. So yeah, I mean, as I said, I kind of fell into this work. I left university not being clear what I wanted to do. I'd done an undergraduate degree in business management, which was very interesting in terms of kind of the social and psychological issues that I looked at. But I kind of realised I didn't want to actually go into a corporate, sorry, Beck, in the same way that the other students were. But I had undertaken an industrial relations course. And I just remember having a moment actually when I was listening to the impact of the miners' strike back in the 80s on communities here in the UK who were industrial communities. And I realised the power of policy, I guess. I realised how policy could shape people's lives and livelihoods, and again, also their futures. So I kind of left university knowing I wanted to do something about policy. But I wasn't clear, and I disappeared to Japan for a couple of years and taught English whilst I thought about it. But I think I got the travel bug then. So I came back to the UK and did a master's in international policy development. So I was definitely taking that policy forward. And started my career in the international development space, working for an organisation called Plan International. And what got me into the domestic abuse space was that wherever I travelled in the world, again, I had preconceptions about what the issues would be in the communities that I went to. Plan International was very child-centred, so we would start with the children's views and then kind of work out to families and community. And in every community, the top issue was violence against women and girls. And I was like, wow. And then I had another wow moment. I was like, oh my God, this happens in the UK. Because again, I'd led this really naive, charmed life. And it was one of those funny things. I Googled policy UK domestic abuse and a role came up at the charity Refuge and the deadline was the next day. And this was back in the day where you had to like mail your application. So there was clearly no time to mail it. So I had to write it, print it, and then get up very early the next morning. And I actually hand delivered it to the reception at Refuge. And I got the job. So that's what got me into Refuge. And that's when I started to understand economic abuse and want to do something about it. And as I said, there was nothing out there at the time, nothing in practice, policy, legislation. So I undertook the first piece of research around economic abuse in the UK and looked at women and children's experiences of it. And at the same time, actually, as I was doing that work, Adrienne Adams in Michigan State University in the US was also doing her first piece of work around economic abuse, which actually we now have legislation based on here in the UK. I would add the women on this screen and other women, just inspire. You're just all incredible. And I definitely couldn't do this work, back to the motivation piece, without any of you. That is for sure. So I'd created a bit of a website as a kind of a hub, I guess, for everything that I'd found, because I recognised there was very little out there. So everything that there was out there, I kind of put on a resource website, as I called it. And I actually called it Surviving Economic Abuse, kind of like a forerunner, I guess, to the charity that I went on to found. And I added to it over the years, did more research, found more amazing women out there and men. And I guess I waited for someone to do something about it. And that didn't happen. And then in 2016, similarly, I was lucky to access a Churchill Fellowship, and I actually travelled to Australia, which is where I met Beck for the first time. and the US, because I knew that good practice was happening out there. And so I went to learn all about it. And whilst I didn't meet Erica in the US, that was not for want of trying. She's a very busy woman. But I was able to connect with her, and actually the work of the Centre for Surviving Agency and Justice in the US inspired Surviving Economic Abuse first founding project, which was called the Economic Justice Project. So yeah, as I say, I just couldn't have done this work without the amazing people that I know because of it. So I came back from the US and Australia, and I just couldn't not do the work. Sounds awful, you know, previous employers mustn't listen to me, but everything else just felt completely meaningless. I just kept thinking, if I've seen this response to victims and survivors in other countries, this has to be what women in the UK can access and other survivors. And yeah, so I went part-time in my job. I was working for a university at the time. And yeah, I started this charity. Again, I actually believe timing has been a really significant part of the journey. I remember my husband turning to me in bed one morning and going, "Did you know that the Prime Minister is going to introduce legislation around domestic abuse?" And I was like, "Is she?" And it was Theresa May at the time, and she was looking to create landmark legislation before she moved on. And so the Domestic Abuse Act of 21, introduced in 2017, took a long time to happen, actually provided the most amazing opportunity. And I advocated very early on, when it was just me, that economic abuse be named within the statutory definition of domestic abuse that the Act was going to introduce, and also to define economic abuse within the legislation. So that's where Adrian Adams's definition of economic abuse came in handy, because government said, well, what's it, you know, how do we define it? And I was like, well, here we are. And as academic, you know, that's just incredible. And it just shows how Adrian's work is absolutely based in survivors' experiences. And, you know, that's also really important, of course. And then at the same time, there was a bit of a revolution happening in the UK, also in the financial services sector, around something which we call the vulnerability agenda. And again, that was a recognition, and we all saw this during COVID, that any of us can be vulnerable because of life events. Again, nothing to do with us. It's to do with, you know, context and other people a lot of the time. And relationship breakdown initially was recognised as an issue, and then again worked really closely with the Financial Conduct Authority, which developed some guidance around vulnerability to have domestic abuse and then economic abuse specifically recognised as a driver of customer vulnerability. And in 2018, UK Finance, which is our membership organisation for banks in the UK, developed a financial abuse code. So the legislation alongside the domestic abuse code just created, you know, fantastic momentum within the UK, obviously created a lot of attention from the press. Absolutely feel what Beck says about, you know, raising awareness and at the same time there being no support services. But again, because of the legislation, government did invest in services around economic abuse. And it was partnerships with organisations like Money Advice Plus and the banks who had signed up to the Financial Abuse Code that started to create the context, which meant that victims and survivors could get responses that were appropriate. And fundamentally created what we like to call economic justice, you know, that there was a response and that we could find a way of at least mitigating what had happened, although we got to a point, certainly in relation to the issue of coerced debt now, where a lot of victims and survivors can gain reparation and actually have that money paid back to them, which is just incredible. So yeah, so it's been quite the journey. More recently, it's been a full circle moment, I guess, having been inspired by work internationally. Countries started to come and ask us questions at Surviving Economic Abuse. A team of around 30 fantastic individuals doing amazing work about what we were doing and how we were working with these stakeholders, these non-traditional stakeholders that the domestic abuse sector had never worked with before. But again, through the Domestic Abuse Act, certainly our statutory legislation and guidance now recognises the role, you know, of financial services, of utilities, of other essential services, of employers. You know, this really is something that everyone in society needs to be responding to. And so it was natural for me to step away from C mid last year to actually start working, and again, full back circle for me in terms of my career back in the international development space. So working with the International Finance Corporation based at the World Bank to support work in Asia and the Pacific around economic abuse, to work with Inequity, which works around women's financial inclusion, to work with organisations like the Grameen Foundation based in the US and working in all countries like India, but also to co-found the International Coalition Against Economic Abuse with Beck and Messi, who have been part of the story in terms of how things have moved forward in relation to this space. And certainly Sonia started Free From at the same time as I started Surviving Economic Abuse. So I kind of feel like we've all been on this journey together, and whichever direction we all head off into, you know, we're all kind of connected by this fantastic connection that we have, which, you know, I really truly value. So yeah, that's got me to where I am now. And just very quickly, I'm also now quality assuring domestic abuse related deaths. I'm seeing economic abuse in all of those. It's so common. Again, our stats in the UK have shown us that 95% of women who experience domestic abuse experience economic abuse here. You know, and we see it play out in homicides, sadly, you know, every day. And it's that structural piece that is just so important. You know, we do fantastic work, but we've got to address the economic conditions, the systems, the discrimination that, you know, that is always going to constrain what we do. So that's my real focus at the moment.
Thank you so much, Nicola, for that. And I love that you kind of started by the, you know, more traditional kind of pathway into going into, you know, a big organization like Plan and others, but actually within that, finding a space of a piece of work that really wasn't addressed, like economic abuse, and you know, and starting kind of working with that. But also that kind of passion, like leaving a place and carrying on a little bit with the work on your own account, even when you're in another job doing something else, just tells you about kind of the passion. And I think passion is important in everything what we do. And then the courage to continue and do like the systemic change that you've all kind of spoken about too, that actually has been what's actually been breaking barriers. So thank you so much for that. Erica, tell us a little bit about your journey.
Sure. When you asked the question of sort of where my journey began, it actually began when I was a child, and I was really born into the movement to end violence against women. When I was a little girl, my mother and a number of just incredible community activists organized to create the first shelter in our community. There were no shelters back then. People were staying in one another's homes. And so those are some of the way back roots of my work. But then to fast forward into my sort of work life. So shortly after CSAJ was created, in about 2008, we organized a conference, and the conference was about just starting to think about what consumer rights for survivors might look like. And on one side of the room, there were folks who identified as domestic violence advocates. And on the other side of the room were folks who were very clearly consumer lawyers. And there was a literal gulf in the room, right? I remember advocates, DV advocates on the one hand were saying, if only consumer lawyers understood the safety needs of survivors in doing their consumer work. And the consumer lawyers were saying, if only domestic violence advocates and lawyers understood sort of what it takes to push forward a consumer case or to access remedies, So there was a gulf, a literal gulf in that room. And both folks, right, both groups were working with survivors, but they were not communicating with one another. They didn't understand the ways in which their work intersected. And there was a clear need for partnership and collaboration. And so we created programs that would attempt to bridge that gap, to kind of create the connective tissue between this very siloed work. So, to give you a sense of how that evolved, so in 2012, we released a needs assessment of the field to try and get a sense of what people were doing, what economic advocacy looked like. And we learned that at that time, few lawyers and advocates were screening for economic abuse, let alone addressing it. We also learned that sort of the more technical aspects of economic and consumer advocacy, like debt defense and bankruptcy and tax, were pretty much not within people's realm of skills. And I think even more troubling was the fact that the field lacked institutional processes, protocols. It was not built into sort of the DNA of our organizations at that time. So fast forward to 2024, which was just last year, and there has been enormous growth and change, which of course we knew, but it was nice to see. Most advocates are screening for economic abuse and are actively engaging in economic and consumer advocacy that centers survivors' economic lived experiences. They're holding both the economic piece as well as the safety piece at the same time, and really thinking about how that experience meets an individual survivor's needs. We also have seen just a huge groundswell of systems and policy changes that target economic abuse at the national, state, and local level throughout the United States. I think another illustration of this is that, when we began our work, the term coerced debt was a problem without a name. We heard from survivors and advocates about the enormous debt loads that they were experiencing as a result of their intimate partner's abuse. And we supported advocates and lawyers in trying to figure out, okay, what are the tools that we have? How can we use those to address this issue? But over the years, we have also strategized with advocates and attorneys, working alongside them to create laws and sort of imagine new solutions that meet this problem, and have partnered with researchers like Adrienne Adams and others to put a name to that problem of coerced debt, and to create solutions that will address it. We've also, again, through our work with survivors and advocates, this issue of coerced debt, of course, has emerged as a systemic challenge, and one very much in need of policy, institutional, and systems change. And so we've had the pleasure of leading a group called our National Coerced Debt Working Group, which has partnered with advocates across the country to spark literally a groundswell of change. Some of the highlights that I would just lift up are, now in the United States, the Federal Violence Against Women Act includes economic abuse within its definition, as well as many states across the US following suit. We have advocated for things like the passage of the Debt Bondage Repair Act, which now grants trafficking survivors who have debt with protections from the debt that's resulted from the conduct of their traffickers. We've engaged in, as the political tides have shifted, there have been different opportunities for expanding the federal government's response through agencies like the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. And at the local level, there has just been a proliferation of states that have now developed. I believe it's 8 states at this moment, with many more activated to create laws that both define and address and provide protections for survivors of economic abuse and coerced debt. So that, that landscape shift has been enormous. Earlier, when I was talking about some of the why I do this work, I mentioned, the stories of Barbara and Nasratu, and I think those stories also show something that we know to be true, which is that safety is an equity issue, and that while all people can experience domestic violence, not all people have access to the economic resources to be able to have options to navigate their way to safety. So a lot of our work over the past decade or so has been very much focused on approaching the work from an economic equity lens in particular. We know that there's a disparate impact of poverty on marginalized communities in the US. We also know that BIPOC communities, Black, Indigenous, and other communities of color in the US are much more likely to experience all forms of violence, including domestic violence. And so when you take those things together, it really behooves us as a field to think about how we can better center the economic needs of survivors from that lens of equity. At CSAJ, this has meant a couple of things. First is that we have had the real pleasure not just of convening folks, but also of supporting a group of a survivor advocate advisory board, which is the leaders in terms of devising a national economic equity policy platform. And for the past 2 years, this group, the survivor-led systems change group, has been pushing forward this very powerful economic policy platform. And at the same time, I'll just add that I think in that equity work, data has been critical. Because of course we know that systems change is essential. It's essential to have data to make that case. So CSAJ has a survivor economic equity dashboard, otherwise known as the SEED dashboard. And it really maps out how economic resources are distributed in all 50 states across the US, which then provides advocates and policymakers and funders with data that they can then leverage, both in the form of numbers, and I have to say also in the form of stories, which is really exciting to be able to have, to better align how our systems and policies respond and support survivor safety. So, yeah, there's been great transformation, and just so thrilled to be able to have this, shift in terms of seeing how economics has both become better understood, but also how we've developed as a movement really important and powerful tools to shift that landscape together.
Thank you so much, Erica. I think one thing that you mentioned and that touched my heart was being a kind of a child activist. You should see my poor daughter. She's been in like Reclaim the Night rallies from like age 7 with no more signs. So now I know that she has potentially the future of changing the world through that. So that's amazing. Also connecting areas, people that do not talk that well. Maybe we have the role of being that kind of middle point that actually can allow two parties that don't synchronize always well to actually start having dialogue, the importance of research and data. And I think the other thing that I loved about what you said is the kind of role of advocacy and bringing advocacy into the spectrum. Sometimes I feel that things remain too theoretical and never come down to advocates and how can they incorporate that in their everyday role. So I think that's, sounds as part of the work. I have to say, for anybody seeing us, if you want like the history of economic abuse, these five ladies have laid it out for you in their journeys, because they are being part of that history. And I have to say that it's amazing to hear. And I guess the other thing I want to mention is, for everybody who's worked in this space, you would realize how recent the history of economic abuse is compared to shelters and advocates and, court programs, right? Like how it's been an issue that, even though has affected people so much, actually was picked up, much later in the process. How many people had been affected. So that's being something that's thrilled me. Messeret, I understand that we have an economic abuse day that is starting in Canada. Can you tell us a little bit more about it and how it has become a global campaign?
Okay, yes, Economic Abuse Awareness Day held in November 26, which is this very personal day for me. And the day I know economic abuse and the day I decide to leave, it's very personal. And also it's the second days of 60 days of activism. So the reason is one of the biggest barriers to change the decisions makers of mindset is lack of awareness. So I reached out all city councils and mayors, shelters, all women's service organizations in these countries to proclaim and to have a national day. So that's what we started. So we started this movement in 2019 and 2020. We are able to mobilize 60 big organizations across Canada to advocate, to join us, and to include on the National Action Plan. And then every year, I remember in 2021, we get connected, these global sisters together. We're able to write a report. We're also able to share 16 stories across the world, 4 stories from each countries. And then in 2023, we also submitted, a report for the UN Women to understand economic abuse through the group of, supporters. And what we learned, this movement now, it really changed at the grassroots level, starting from the mayor to national organization in Canada. Right now, we are pushing all governments in November 26 to reflect back and to make sure that they have funding for economic abuse, research for economic abuse, create a platform to talk about it, and then finding a ways and, to support that. And in addition to that, also, we're able to develop national economic abuse victim council. So this is also part of the awareness, campaign. And right now, because of that, we are also advising some banks on product development, which is another, big change. And then also we're able to expand the Debra. I know Erika, she already mentioned about the course debt bill. It was introduced in the US. Now we're asking Canadian government to introduce on Bill 41 through the National Day. So this National Day is just like, it's not only my story, and I'm happy everyone is joining and then sharing that. But for us, it's a big movement, and we really, really bring to make these things at the House of Commons and as a Senate because of the National Day.
I appreciate it comes from your kind of own personal experience. I think those are the drivers that create real change, and that you've used that and that moment to really be able to activate a campaign like that. I think it gives it meaning. So thank you very much for that and for all the work the team's doing.
Thank you.
Now, to all of you, are gonna, bear with me. I need a fire round session with you of like one thing that if you have to choose, you think is really important when you're doing economic abuse work. So I'm gonna start by Sonia, please. That one thing.
It's really important that any programs, policies, legislation, anything that is developed to address economic abuse is built with a basic framework that is rooted in trusting survivors.
Survivor centered. Yeah. And Becca.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's going to be probably central to everyone listening to Survivors. But I will go the step further.
You have to find another one then. You can't repeat. Nobody can repeat.
No one
be
can
careful.
repeat. Okay. So for me, I talk about the holy trinity of safety, dignity, and justice. I think we're getting a lot better at looking at safety and, what does economic safety mean? But economic safety without, upholding someone's dignity and without just responses and just outcomes is not enough.
Thank you. Meseret.
Actually, for me, it's also Survivor. I don't know if it's allowed to say it.
So you
But yeah,
have to find another one. No, go ahead.
Okay, so I can say maybe two, I don't know. So yeah, the most important thing, of course, as someone who have also lived experience, lived experience is very, very crucial and important. And what I feel and what I see every day, survivors, they shouldn't be just heard, but they should also lead the way, because we need to make sure that they have their own voice, dignity, and then a power, because economic abuse is not about finance, it's all about power, right? So I think that's the most important thing. And the other most important thing is financial equity is very important, because equity is not about having a structure, but equity is beyond that, making sure that vulnerable populations, Indigenous, Black, gender diverse folks is included in any program. Intersectionality is very, very critical. So that's what I learned.
Thank you so much. Nicola.
I'm going to use that catch-all partnership term, because that's partnership with survivors, partnership with those non-traditional stakeholders that we've all spoken to, as well as the traditional stakeholders, and overcoming those gulfs between them, as Erica spoke to. I think, you just can't do this work without bringing your specialism to it and fusing that together and kind of creating this magic, I think, that happens. And I love it now, because people create solutions that I really don't understand. And that to me means success, because people are taking those concepts and those understandings that we've talked about and they're applying them in their spaces and they're creating that change. So it's that partnership, that us all coming together. We are this movement, we are this global movement now, and we are accelerating change.
And Erica.
Yes, I think it's a variation on a theme. So I would I would call it really being intentional about shifting from service provision to survivor-centered advocacy. So I think a lot of the maybe unintended consequences of funding streams and the building of the domestic violence movement has in some ways led to compartmentalization of services. I provide a particular thing, whether it's housing or protection orders or public benefits, but we know that survivors are full people and we need to meet survivors where they are with their full lives. And bring into the advocacy relationship both an assessment of risk, but also of strength and assets. And so really that partnership with survivors in a way that honors their expertise and develops solutions that fit people's particular needs and circumstances.
Thank you so much. And throughout the conference, you've been hearing about the International Coalition Against Economic Abuse, which the Center for Women's Economic Safety hosts. Nicola, do you want to explain to everybody what it is and what it intends to do?
I can do really quickly. Everyone in this screen is involved in the summit, as are hopefully many people, involved in the coalition, as I hope many people watching the summit. But as I said, our mission really is to collectively accelerate the efforts, not only to address economic abuse, but to stop it happening, closing down the ability for that control. We want to do that by raising awareness. We're calling for an International Economic Abuse Awareness Day. We've already acknowledged that came from Canada. It's the 26th of November. If it's not in your diary, put it in there now. So we're calling on the UN to recognise it formally, but we're also supporting national governments or supporting organisations to support national governments to do the same. We're connecting stakeholders, elevating the work of the coalition members, And we're sharing that practice, that learning, that research, that evidence, everything that we've been speaking about, because we couldn't be doing it, I think, without each other, and we all have limited resource and we all have limited time. So if we can pull all of that together, and as I say, accelerate those efforts, that's really what we want to achieve via the coalition.
Thank you so much, Sonia, Messeret, Nicola, Erica, Rebecca. Hearing you, I feel like we are in safe hands. Like this is the leadership that is moving this topic. So I appreciate so much your work. And I'm sure everybody who's listening to us will hear your stories and will get ideas. And we're creating that next generation that keeps on following us to also create change. Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody, hearing us today.